By September 14, 1940, the RMS Empress of Asia was well past her prime. The Canadian Pacific luxury liner was nearly 30 years old. Her Edwardian interiors, while lovingly maintained, felt stuffy and dated. Her coal-powered boilers belched out thick black smoke, and her once gleaming white hull, recently painted war gray, was already streaked with deep lines of rust. In Europe, the Allies withered under Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg, and while the Second Sino-Japanese War raged between the Republic of China and the Japanese Empire, the Pacific was relatively quiet. Still, the air was tense, and the clouds of war loomed just over the horizon. But for now, in the quiet finery of the Empress of Asia's white-paneled first-class dining saloon, the war felt like it was a million miles away. There were just 193 passengers on board, served by a crew of 400. The ship was only a few hours out of Yokohama, the final stop before she crossed the Pacific to Vancouver. But just after 1:30 p.m., as lunch was nearing its end, the dining room was jostled by a strange metallic bang, followed by the sounds of crashing crockery and rushing water. This was followed by the sounds of men screaming out in pain. At first, it was assumed that there was some sort of accident in the ship's galley, but soon word spread of something far more terrifying. The Empress of Asia had been attacked. High overhead, Japanese bombers dropped at least 8 bombs on the liner, one with near pinpoint accuracy. While most missed the ship, splashing into the water around her, one slammed into her boat deck, just missing her wireless cabin and children's playroom as it sliced through her promenade deck and 2 first-class cabins, penetrating deep into the ship before it finally stopped in the thick cement and tile of the galley floor. The impact injured 3 members of the galley crew. Captain Gould ordered the ship into a zigzag maneuver, and Chief Officer Donald Smith quickly assembled a crew to put out any fire and contain the damage. While there was no panic, passengers quickly donned life jackets and raced topside to their lifeboat stations. In the chaos, some thought that they were being attacked by the Germans. As excited passengers streamed up the stairs, the ship's surgeon Robert Swan and nurse Julie Harwood pushed through the crowds to reach the injured galley crew. Just as quickly as they appeared, the planes vanished over the horizon. The danger had passed, the small fire was put out, and the burst galley pipes were repaired. Passengers took off their life jackets and went back to their normal shipboard routines, excitedly sharing stories of where they were when their ship was bombed. With damage contained to just 2 first-class cabins in the galley, the Empress of Asia continued on to Yokohama. The Japanese issued a swift apology, explaining that the Empress was mistaken for a target ship during a training exercise. The accidental bombing was an ominous preview of the horrors to come. In just a few months, the Empress of Asia would be pressed into wartime service, and the once pride of the Canadian Pacific Fleet would soon fall prey to the Japanese onslaught, as the world was consumed by war. After the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad opened in 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway turned its attention to the sea. In 1887, under the leadership of Sir William Cornelius Van Horn, the company chartered 3 vessels from the Cunard Line with the intention of establishing a trans-Pacific passenger service between Vancouver, British Columbia, and Asia. 3 years later, after the experiment proved profitable, the company approved plans to build their own liners. In 1891, the newly established Canadian Pacific Steamship Company introduced RMS Empress of China, Empress of India, and Empress of Japan, starting off a naming convention that they would use for most of their liners. The intention was to provide an uninterrupted route for citizens of the United Kingdom between England and the Far East by providing a transcontinental railroad that would take passengers from Quebec to Vancouver, where they could then board liners that service ports in Japan, China, Hong Kong, Manila, and Honolulu. By 1910, the company's 3 original liners were well past their prime. Plans to replace the liners took on new urgency on July 27, 1911, when the Empress of China ran aground near Tokyo Bay in a heavy fog. While no one was injured, the liner was a total loss. The Empresses of India and Japan were reliable, but they lacked modern luxuries and their speed lagged behind newer competitors, which put their lucrative mail and silk contracts at risk. The company's Pacific Fleet needed new flagships. A $5 million order was placed at the Fairfield shipyards in Govan near Glasgow, Scotland, for 2 nearly identical 3-funnel liners. What would become the RMS Empress of Russia and RMS Empress of Asia were intended to make a statement. Fast, modern, and luxurious, Canadian Pacific looked to cement their dominance over trans-Pacific travel. Speed was a top priority. Each ship was equipped with 6 double-ended and 4 single-ended cylindrical coal-fired boilers that fed steam to a set of Parsons direct-drive turbines that drove 4 propellers. They each sported a modern cruiser stern to improve stability and handling, 2 of the first liners to incorporate such a design. While their planned service speed was 18.5 knots, both ships easily exceeded this during trials. The Empress of Asia averaged 20.3 knots and reached an impressive top speed of 21.4 knots. The Empress of Asia was christened on November 23, 1912, by Augusta Eileen Bosworth, wife of CPR Vice President George Morris Bosworth. It was a cold and misty day, but the launch went off without a hitch. The gleaming white hull slid seamlessly into the water. She would measure 570.2 feet or 173.8 meters in length, with a beam of 68.2 feet or 20.8 meters, and came in at 16,909 gross registered tons. She sported a double bottom, 8 decks, and lower holds below. She could accommodate 200 passengers in first class, 100 in second, and 888 in steerage. She was operated by 475 officers and crew. Inside, the Empress of Asia and her sister exemplified some of the finest first-class interiors placed on any pre-war liner, sporting intricate plasterwork and wood paneling, glass and wrought iron domes, fine furnishings, art, and bright, warm spaces, all reminiscent of a fine English manor house. Canadian Pacific was delighted with the new ships. They were fine examples of Scottish shipbuilding, some of the sturdiest and best equipped liners of the time. But little did they know that their careful engineering and craftsmanship would be put to the test multiple times over their long careers, which spanned both world wars and would eventually bring about their ends. RMS Empress of Asia sailed her maiden voyage in June 1913. It would be a unique round-the-world cruise that left Liverpool on June 14th, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and ended in Vancouver 3 months later. The exclusive voyage would visit nearly a dozen ports from South Africa to Japan. She carried 100 first-class passengers and some 500 people in steerage, as well as over $3 million worth of silk. All in all, it was a great success. Soon, the Empress of Asia and Empress of Japan went to work on their intended routes between Vancouver and Asia. The 2 liners were the fastest on the Pacific at the time, and each vied for speed records. In May 1914, Captain Samuel Robinson sailed from Yokohama to William Head in British Columbia in 9 days, 2 hours, and 14 minutes. That time was soon bested by the Empress of Russia. The record set by the 2 empresses would remain for 9 years. Their impressive speed allowed Canadian Pacific to extend their routes to Manila while maintaining the deadlines stipulated by their mail contracts. But the promising start wouldn't last long. The Empress of Asia was in Hong Kong on August 3, 1914, when she received word that war had broken out in Europe. She was immediately requisitioned and converted into an auxiliary cruiser. Within 2 weeks, her decks were fitted with 8 old 4.7-inch guns, 4 forward and 4 aft. Her hull was painted war gray, and her fine furnishings, art, and anything else deemed unnecessary were all removed and placed in storage. Command was turned over to Royal Navy officers, and only crew who were already in the Royal Navy Reserve remained with the ship. Her speed and size made her valuable, but she was also incredibly vulnerable. Undergunned and under-armored, she was plagued with flaws that hampered every luxury liner converted into an auxiliary cruiser at the start of the war. The Empress of Asia and Empress of Russia were given nearly identical assignments and spent most of the war together. They were mainly tasked with relatively safe assignments patrolling for enemy ships. In 1914, Asia briefly served as an escort ship, and in September she was sent along with HMS Hampshire to search for the German light cruiser SMS Emden. While Emden's logs mentioned sighting the lights of 2 ships late one night, the pair never spotted her and eventually ended their nearly 2-month-long search. The German cruiser was eventually spotted and disabled by HMAS Sydney on November 9, 1914. Empress of Asia took on wounded German prisoners from her crew, but that was the most action she saw during World War I. After a few more uneventful patrols, it was clear that the 2 Empresses could be better used elsewhere. They were soon returned to Canadian Pacific and resumed their trans-Pacific services carrying passengers and cargo between Canada and Asia. But in 1918, over the protestations of the Canadian government, both ships were again requisitioned by the Admiralty for use as troop transports. They served these roles after the armistice into 1919, helping to repatriate troops. The Empress of Asia emerged from the war unscathed, ready to resume her intended peacetime role. Few at the time could imagine that the liner would ever experience such a conflict ever again. In the years that followed the Great War, travel between North America and Asia increased substantially. For the Canadian Pacific Line in 1921, passenger numbers increased 200% over what the company carried in 1914. Cargo numbers saw a similar increase. Much of this was fueled by Japan's economic boom. While China was racked with instability, Japanese consumers and businesses were eager to purchase foreign goods. At the same time, the tourism industry was growing as more Europeans and North Americans sought out new destinations. The Empress of Asia and the Empress of Russia were returned to service in spring 1919. The 2 liners were relatively new and emerged from the war in excellent condition, though they wouldn't be repainted from their wartime gray until the early 1920s. They were briefly given black hulls before finally returning to white. In 1922, the Empress of Canada joined the fleet. Slightly larger and a little bit more modern, the new liner bolstered the Canadian Pacific Fleet as American shipping lines began to introduce new competition with a series of smaller but well-equipped ships named after American presidents. Despite the competition, the Empress of Asia remained popular throughout the 1920s and 30s. Trans-Pacific voyages were calm and comfortable. To keep up with newer ships offering swimming pools, crews rigged temporary tank pools on the tennis courts on deck to help passengers cool off during long, hot, tropical voyages. In 1926, the Empress of Asia was involved in her only major peacetime accident, when the liner rammed a British coastal steamer in the Yangtze River in Shanghai. Badly damaged, the small steamer sank quickly, killing 5 to 10 of its crew members. The Asia was not seriously damaged. It would be another 10 years before she experienced any major disruption. In 1937, as the Second Sino-Japanese War intensified, the Empress of Asia and Empress of Canada were called upon to help evacuate civilians from Shanghai as the Empire of Japan and the Republic of China fought for control of the city, in what some consider to be the first major battle of World War II. Shanghai was one of the most important ports in China at the time, and already a regular stop for the Empress of Asia. When she arrived on August 7, 1937, the situation was tense, but the battle had not yet begun. She carried a normal load of passengers to Hong Kong, arriving on the 10th before continuing on to Manila. By the time she returned to Hong Kong on the 15th, Shanghai was descending into chaos. The Empress of Asia was called up by the Royal Navy to assist in evacuations. The liner would carry 776 Royal Ulster Rifle troops to the besieged city, and return to Hong Kong with 1,393 civilians, mostly European families. The voyage was hot and overcrowded. Many passengers slept on deck due to the lack of beds. But fortunately for everyone on board, the voyage to Hong Kong was brief. The liner safely arrived on the 23rd. The incident was just a hint of what was to come. Despite the war, RMS Empress of Asia and her sisters carried on. Even after she was bombed by Japanese planes in September 1940, the Asia carried on with her regular passenger service for a few more months. But the war finally caught up with her. She was requisitioned by the British Admiralty on January 11, 1941, just after she completed her 307th Pacific voyage, the last peacetime voyage of her career. She was sent to Liverpool via the Panama Canal, where she would be converted into a troop ship. Once again, her fine fittings were stripped away, and the ship was modified to accommodate as many troops as possible. Areas like her bridge and radio shack were fortified. While at first she was only lightly armed, heavier guns and better anti-aircraft protection were later added. She was even given depth charges. By 1941, Britain and her allies were losing the war, and transport ships like the Empress of Asia and her sisters were badly needed. The liner immediately went to work, sailing all over the world as the United Kingdom struggled to support its collapsing empire. On November 13, 1941, the Empress of Asia and Empress of Japan departed the United Kingdom as part of a convoy bound for Singapore. The Asia carried 2,235 troops. Badly overcrowded, the situation on board was tense as the aging liner prepared for her departure. Some troops even tried to leave the ship, but they were held back by armed guards. As they got underway, Asia's vulnerabilities became clear. She was one of the largest coal-burning ships in the convoy of approximately 27 vessels, her funnels belching out thick black smoke that could be seen for miles. During her prime, she could reach speeds of 20 knots or more, but her performance relied on the skills and dedication of the crew that fed her boilers. From the moment they left port, it was abundantly clear that the poorly trained and haphazardly gathered 160 firemen and drummers were not up to the task. The Empress of Asia immediately lagged behind the convoy, barely shuffling through the U-boat-infested waters off the coast of North Africa. When the liner finally arrived in Durban, South Africa in December 1941, the men on board learned of the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor and the unfolding assault on Southeast Asia. While information on board was scarce, the situation in their ultimate destination of Singapore was quickly falling apart. The Japanese Empire recognized that their ambitions required full access to the valuable resources of the region, and they were determined to drive out the Western colonial powers and seize the territories. Britain had long controlled the strategically important Singapore at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. Heavily fortified to repel an attack from the sea, the stronghold was vulnerable to an attack by land through Malaya. Due to arrogance and a chronic underestimation of Japanese strength and fighting abilities, the British were totally unprepared for the attacks that began on December 8, 1941. British and Empire forces withered under the onslaught as Japanese forces swept down the peninsula. Outnumbered and outgunned, the tactically superior Japanese regiments rode bicycles through the jungles, winning battle after battle as they moved ever closer to the British stronghold at Singapore. By By the end of January, the peninsula was lost, and Japanese forces were threatening the city, a situation many in Britain thought impossible only a few weeks before. The island's defenses relied heavily on Force C, the British naval squadron headed by the battlecruiser HMS Repulse and the brand new King George V class battleship HMS Prince of Wales. When the Japanese began their offensive on December 8th, the squadron left Singapore under the cover of bad weather, hoping to intercept Japanese Imperial Naval forces. But when the weather began to clear, it became obvious that the ships were hopelessly vulnerable. They should have been accompanied by HMS Indomitable, but the aircraft carrier had run aground in Jamaica, delaying her arrival in the area. Without air support, the ships were sitting ducks. 4C was quickly spotted on the open sea by Japanese torpedo bombers and came under heavy attack. On December 10th, both Repulse and the Prince of Wales were hit multiple times and sunk, taking 850 sailors with them to the bottom. It was the first time capital ships had been sunk from the air. The shocking losses revealed the extent to which naval warfare had changed. It also left Singapore without a key component of its defense. This was the situation that the Empress of Asia was sailing into. The troops taken on in Liverpool left the ship in Durban, and a new group was taken on in Bombay. Special forces heading to reinforce Singapore. News of the lost Repulse and Prince of Wales reached the troopship, creating an uneasy tension on board. Her Canadian Pacific sister, the Empress of Japan, and much of the rest of the original convoy sailed ahead, unburdened by the slow coal bunkering process and unreliable firemen. She arrived in Singapore on January 29, 1942, and escaped the city with 1,700 refugees. The Empress of Asia would not be so lucky. As she limped into the Sunda Straits between Java and Sumatra in early February 1945, the Japanese controlled the skies above, and the complete collapse of Singapore was only a few days away. They would easily spot the thick black smoke that spewed from the slow-moving troopship. Like the city that she hoped to help reinforce, the Empress of Asia's fate was already sealed. The Empress of Asia was joined by the square-funneled French liner Felix Rousseau, the City of Canterbury, and two escorts, HMAS Yara and HMS Danae, as the small convoy slipped into the Bangka Strait on February 4, 1942. Coming in last, the Asia was only one day out of Singapore when the skies above buzzed with the sounds of Japanese planes racing overhead. Soon bombs were raining down on the unprotected liner. But aside from a shattered lifeboat and some superficial damage, she was unharmed, and continued on as the planes vanished over the horizon. It would only be a matter of time before they returned. By the next morning, February 5th, the Empress of Asia was struggling. Low steam pressure left the liner only capable of a pathetic 4 to 5 knot speed. Pressure was so low that water couldn't run to the showers, and toilets wouldn't flush. A naval vessel even pulled alongside the ship and asked if they needed help, but they were waved away. Bill Taylor was an 18-year-old crewman on the Empress of Asia. He had served as a steward on various Canadian Pacific liners in the years before the war. While he tried for a position in the Air Force and the Army, seamen were badly needed and he was relegated to the Merchant Navy pool. Before his death in 2001, he left a memoir detailing his experiences during the war. He knew that the ship was an easy target. His fears were confirmed when at 9 a.m. on February 5, 1942, alarms sounded and men were ordered to their action stations as a wave of Japanese bombers passed overhead without attacking. But almost as soon as they passed out of view, another alarm rang out. Bill was in the dining saloon entrance near the makeshift hospital when he heard the scream of dive bombers, followed by the sound of explosions that knocked him to the floor. As he struggled to his feet, he could see flames engulf the dining saloon. He and other crew members raced to connect fire hoses, but the lack of steam pressure rendered them useless. With nothing to help fight the inferno, Bill and his fellow crew raced topside, hitting the deck every few minutes as roaring plane engines outside rattled the ship, threatening another hit. Between 3 and 5 bombs hit the Empress of Asia. One smashed into her forward funnel, the second pierced the aft end of her first-class lounge, and a third penetrated her starboard side. Fire quickly spread throughout the ship. From the bridge, it was clear to Captain J.B. Smith that his liner was doomed. He ordered all personnel to the bow and stern, as far away from the flames as possible, as crew remained at anti-aircraft stations fighting back the oncoming waves of Japanese attacks. The Asia came to a stop and dropped anchor near the Sultan Shoal lighthouse, just 15 miles away from Singapore. At around noon, orders were given to abandon ship. Those on the stern escaped in rafts and small craft that had been launched from the shore. HMAS Yara managed to pull alongside the burning liner and took on men sheltering on the bow. When Bill Taylor made it topside and reached the bridge, he found it deserted. Surrounded by flames, he was forced to jump into the water below. As he leapt from the burning ship, the drop felt like an eternity. When he finally hit the water, he continued shooting down. It felt as though he bounced off the sea floor before finally shooting back to the surface like a cork, carried by his tattered quilted life jacket. After drifting in the water, he spotted a nearby life raft and climbed on, followed by a few others. A fireman soon joined them and took out a bottle of gin. The men passed it around while they watched their ship burn. They pulled injured men from the water before paddling to the nearby lighthouse. Of the 2,235 troops on board, only 15 were killed in the sinking. 238 were injured. Of the 416 crew members, only one lost his life. The ship burned for hours before finally sinking where she was anchored. While the men and supplies on board would have been a welcome help to the British and Empire forces, it's doubtful that they would have made any difference. The situation was too far gone. Singapore was officially surrendered to the Japanese just 10 days later, on February 15, 1942. The survivors of the Empress of Asia were scattered in the chaos. Some, like Bill, ended up in the besieged city. He volunteered at Singapore General Hospital in the days before the surrender. He was ultimately captured by the Japanese and spent years as a prisoner of war, where he and hundreds of thousands of others endured horrifying conditions. He was finally liberated in 1945. Others from the Asia were able to evacuate the city. One group of 40 men, led by Chief Mate Leonard H. Johnston, hiked over 100 miles and sailed on nearly half a dozen small vessels before finally reaching safety in Fremantle, Australia. Johnston was honored with the Order of the British Empire for his efforts and navigational skills. The war took a heavy toll on Canadian Pacific liners. In total, 12 ships were lost to enemy action and 2 were lost in accidents. The Empress of Russia survived until September 1945. She was gutted by a fire during a refit in Scotland that rendered the liner a total loss. Like her sister, she was erased by the war that destroyed the world she was built for. One empire eclipsed by another, while the people struggle through the ashes. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, support the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps keep the channel afloat. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Until the next one, be nice to people.